If you want to learn how to play the Caro Kann Defense like a 2000 rated player, then this is the video for you. Hello everyone, my name is Alex. I'm a 2000 rated over the board chess player, and in this series we're going from 1000 to 2000 elo in chess.com rapid games, and during the games I will be explaining my thought process as best as I possibly can for your education and your entertainment. And today we are against Ma-NY from Poland in the Caro Kann. And my opponent goes for the knight c3 variation. Now, d4 is a way that he could continue, but he chooses the two knights attack with knight to f3. Now, typically, I like to take, and play knight to f6. However, recently, I have been learning more about the Gurgenidze system. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, where you actually just fianchetto your dark squared bishop, and you wait for white to take you. And I'm not sure whether you can play it in this exact position, because typically you play it after d4 and then g6. But I don't see any reason why I can't play it in this position, and I assume that after d4 the position just transposes. Okay, my opponent takes, which just seems like a bad move. I don't think I'm missing anything here. This just looks wrong. Because at the end of the day, I've got two central pawns, and my opponent has one central pawn. And I mean, sure, he has two knights developed already, and he could develop the bishop to e2 or b5, I suppose. But black has what I would consider to be a much more solid pawn structure. Also, like, a big reason of that being, after the move d4, I think bishop g7 makes the most sense. This actually turns into a modern defense, apparently. The d4 pawn is just weak. It's not a great pawn structure in the center for white, because the knight on c3 is stopping the pawn from coming to c3 to support the d4 pawn, or going c4 to actually pose some problems for my pawn on d5. Sorry, my mic is doing something. Let me just readjust that. 1 second. Apologies, I've just got a new mic set up, and it just kept slowly going down on me. It's just like dropping. Okay, bishop b5. I think bishop d7 is probably the best way to prevent any shenanigans, because knight c6, knight e5, I don't love the look of that. I think bishop d7, and if the knight takes on d5, then of course we just take the bishop. If bishop takes, I think it makes sense to take with the queen, even though knight to e5 can be played attacking my queen. I don't think that's really an issue. I think we can probably play a move like queen to e6 at the very least, and then prepare knight to c6. And my opponent does take. I don't think taking with the knight makes any sense, because then I think we are just hanging the pawn on d5. So I'm going to take with the queen. And yeah, my opponent does go for knight e5. If I play a move like knight to c7, then my opponent can play like knight b5. But then I have this check on a5. And my opponent would be forced to drop his knight back to keep it protected. However, if queen c7 castles, then this is a threat, and I don't love the fact that it continues to exist. If queen e6, though, knight b5 is still an idea, which is rather annoying. I may just have to go queen back to d8, which isn't really what I want to do. I mean, queen d6, knight b5. Well, then I've got, again, queen b4 check, and the knight would have to drop back. So if queen d6 castles, then maybe I just go a6. And I don't love the fact that I'm behind a bit in development, but I think my bishop is going to be a very strong piece. We will see with the engine after the game what the correct approach to this position was, because like I said, I am learning this Gurgenidze system on the go, really. There was an excellent video by Hanging Pawns on it, which I need to go back over. So I'm going to play queen d6, and I think if I get the if I get the ideal outcome that I want to go knight to c6. I think bishop to f4 might actually be a bit annoying. Yeah, my opponent does go for it. But what I'm thinking is if I play knight c6, knight f7 is the move that I assume my opponent's going to play, so that my queen is attacked twice and the rook is attacked. Although, with knight c6, he does have knight to g6, attacking my rook and making sure that his bishop is defended, but then we could take the knight with the queen. So if knight c6, we just take with the queen, and that's absolutely fine. We have no problems there. If knight c6, knight f7, queen f4, knight h8, bishop h8, then we get a knight and a bishop for a rook and a pawn. And I think that that is a beneficial position for black, because I think that the minor pieces are very strong. And I suppose at the end of that line, my opponent can take on d5. But then I think we can queenside castle with oh no, our queen would be under attack. We could give a check on e4, and then like knight to e3, and then maybe we can queenside castle, or just take on d4. That looks really good. Now, am I missing anything? I don't think so. I don't think so. Knight c6, if knight to b5, then again we give this check, and the knight will be forced to drop back. So let's do it. I hope that I'm not blundering anything. This microphone is really annoying me. It keeps like falling down. I've got it on like a boom stand. I think that's what it's called. I'm not great with this techie stuff, but it seems to just keep dropping a little bit. I hope the audio's all right. I think it is. I think it is. It looks fine in my studio app thing. But yeah, okay, my opponent goes for knight to d3, which is kind of what I was expecting, but this doesn't really challenge me all that much. Of course, we can't take because the knight is defending there, but look at the weakness of the d4 pawn. I'm not sure how white is going to address that. I think it actually... I'd like to play this, but then knight to c5 is annoying. Yeah, maybe just queen d8. But then if queen d8, knight b5, then we again have this check on a5, forcing the knight back. Because if queen d8, there are problems with the link up on c7, although I suppose we always have rook to c8 if we really need it. So that should be fine. Let's drop the queen back. And now I think the power of the Gurgenidze system should start to show, I hope. I hope so anyway. Because this d-pawn is just bad. One of the main points that I like about the Gurgenidze is that it only works properly, I believe, if this knight comes to c3, because once there is an exchange of pawns, if this pawn comes to d4, which, for all intensive purposes, it kind of has to, if white's going to remain active in the center of the board, then the knight, like I said, is blocking the c-pawn's movement. My opponent does go for knight to b5, but I think we can just play queen a5 check and force the knight back, and then win the d4 pawn. Yeah, I don't think I'm missing anything, so let's play this check. Normally, there is a bishop defending the knight from the f1 square, but of course the bishops got traded off a few moves ago, which forces the knight back. And then we can go ahead and take on d4. This is not only defended, but the knight is pinned anyway. Our queen is in no danger of getting attacked by anything. The question is whether we want to take on d4 with the knight or with the bishop. That is the question. Now, part of me wants to say bishop, so that I'm threatening bishop c3, pawn c3, queen c3 ideas, but I don't like the idea of giving up my dark square bishop, because it's very powerful. If I take with the knight, on the other hand, I assume my opponent would castle, and then we're not able to play the move that I want to play, which is e5, because our knight is not controlling this square. However, if bishop takes castles and e5, then our bishop is cut off from getting back home. However, in that variation, my opponent could go bishop to e3, which forces a bishop trade, which feels a little bit uncomfortable. It might be simpler to play knight takes d4, and after castles, just play the move e6, followed by knight to e7 and castles kingside. it is annoying that it's taking me a while to get my king castled, and knight takes d4 doesn't actually come with any threats, although I suppose we are pressuring c2, so the queen is somewhat tied down to that square. Knight takes d4, my opponent could play the move b4, because our knight would no longer be controlling the b4 square. Now, that would open up some issues on this diagonal, which we could maybe exploit. But that is a little bit annoying. I feel like despite what I want to do, despite the fact that I want to keep my bishop on g7, I think it makes more sense to take on d4 with the bishop. And my opponent goes bishop d2, which I don't think is a very testing line whatsoever. I think that makes our life very, very easy. I think that white should have castled here. And if I were to take in this position, yes, I'm up 2 pawns, but I'm also not castled yet. I've lost my dark squared bishop, and I have massive dark squared weaknesses on my king side, and my king still needs a couple more moves to get itself castled. So I think bishop d2 is not a great move. I'm tempted to play queen to b6 to get out of any discoveries, and also threaten bishop to f2. If queen b6 castles, which is what I assume... Oh, well, the knight defends that square anyway, I suppose. So... maybe? Well, no, a6 can be met with knight to e2, attacking my bishop and my queen. And again, I don't want to give my bishop away. I could drop my bishop all the way back. And this knight doesn't have any great forward movement, because take, right? I think I like just bishop to e7, keeping things nice and simple. White has no good discovered attacks in this position. We keep monitoring these 2 annoying squares that the knight could get into. We probably will have to drop our queen back to d8. Which, I mean, I would like to keep my queen active if possible. But at the end of the day, if we're up a pawn, then that's cool with me. By the way, if you're enjoying the videos so far and finding it entertaining and or useful, then I'd really appreciate it if you could drop a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Really helps me to keep these daily uploads going in terms of motivation, because it's a fair bit of work. I do love it, but it's a fair bit of work. Okay, knight f6 is the move that I want to play here. Preparing to castle and also defending the d5 pawn, because my opponent is threatening to take it. He's also threatening to take it with the knight, with a discovered attack on my queen, and attacks coming on c7, which is kind of annoying. Now, knight to d4 can be considered here. Definitely can be considered. Attacking the queen and the c2 pawn. The queen, if it takes on d5, if take, knight c2, I suppose we could take on c2 first. White will be counter-attacking on c7, though. So I think I prefer the move knight to f6. Again, I don't think I'm blundering any forward knight movement from my opponent, because knight takes d5, we just take it. You, of course, can't go to either of these squares because I take you. And if you come to e4, I can actually just take it with the d-pawn, which counterattacks the queen. My opponent castles. Again, none of his forward movement with the knight works, so I'm going to castle. And now I think we're out of the woods. We're up a pawn. We have developed... well, all of our minor pieces. Our queen is out, but our queen is going to have to retreat at some point soon. We've got a very annoying pawn for white to deal with in the center, and we still have 2 central pawns, so we could even play a move like e5 and try and roll these pawns down the board to take space. Of course, there is the issue of the bishop and discovered attacks against my queen. But now that my opponent's castled, the bishop isn't defended. So if my... let's just say, for the sake of argument, my opponent could take on d5 with the knight, then he'd just be losing his bishop anyway. a3 is a strange move. That's a very strange move. We could go knight to d4 and force the queen back to d1, but I don't think that's what I want to do. I think that it makes way more sense to play the move e5 and prepare e4. Because again, this knight can't come forward, right? If my opponent wants to retreat to b1 so that the bishop remains defended, then I don't care. I will just put my queen back on b6, and we're going to have a very nice position. And the knight's going to have to come back out anyway, so it's going to be a complete waste of time. If e5, do I have to be concerned about the move b4? The only thing I'm thinking is after b4, queen b6, b5, the knight is going to be dislodged from its defense of e5, but I can play knight to d4 in those cases, getting out of the attack with a tempo on the queen. So I'm going to play e5. I think that's the principled move, taking a ton of space in the center. This pawn is defended. I suppose, after the move b4, if queen b6, my opponent can actually just take on d5, which I admit I kind of overlooked. So if b4, I probably have to go queen d8, but that's fine. That's fine. Again, on the move b5, I can play knight to d4, or I can actually just play e4 with a fork, because you can't take my knight because I'll take your queen. So I think that my opponent's grouping of pieces in the center of the board could be a bit of an issue for him, because I'm going to roll forward very quickly. And it's funny that for the past 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 turns, my queen and my opponent's bishop have been watching each other. But that doesn't mean that you should just retreat your queen because you're scared, right? Actually think about, does your opponent have any threats? And my opponent goes b4. Of course, we're going to drop the queen back to d8. I would prefer it on b6 maybe, but then again, on b6, it's still vulnerable to bishop to e3. But then we would have ideas of d4. The queen on d8 isn't ideal, but it's fine. It will do. It's doing the job of defending d5. If b5, knight d4, queen d1, we'll just play something like rook to e8. My opponent goes knight to c5, which stops this, admittedly. It attacks b7, sure. Can I just play b6? Can I just play b6? That's the question. And your knight's going to be forced to the a6 square. Or b3, I suppose. You could go to b3. But you seem a little bit out of the game there, because my pawns are dominating this knight's forward movement. I often talk about this relationship with a bishop, but it can also happen with pawns, right? Knights can be restricted by other types of pieces. We are getting a little bit low on time. Knight d4 can be played, attacking the queen, because if knight b7, we take on f3 with check. So my opponent will be forced to take back, and then we can move our queen. But if knight d4, I just think the threat of knight d4 is stronger than the actual execution of it. So I prefer the move b6 here. You do have to be aware of the fact that if you now move the d-pawn, your knight on c6 will be hanging behind it. But I don't think that's a problem, because I want to play moves like rook c8 anyway, because the c2 pawn is weak and the knight on c3 is weak, which is a perennial problem of the way that my opponent has played this position. In many Caro Kann lines, where the knight is on c3 and the pawn is on c2 and the d-pawn advances to d4, there is often weaknesses down the c-file as a result of that. And even though this is technically a modern defense, according to the chess.com, I don't even know what to call it, like opening explorer, this doesn't feel like a traditional Caro Kann in fairness, but this might be a typical kind of position for a Gurgenidze system. So if any of you do play the Gurgenidze Caro Kann, I really hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, by the way, then please let me know if there's anything in particular I should know about it based on this game, or just in general. I'm sure Draco Laoki, I'm sure you're going to have some interesting thoughts for me about the Gurgenidze system. But yeah, I think moves like e4 are always lurking in the air, unleashing my bishop. My opponent goes bishop g5, which of course pins the knight. I think we can just play h6 though. Yeah, I think we can just play h6. Or no, because then d5 isn't a bit weak. So maybe we start with e4. Just cutting the queen's connection. Or we could play d4, just getting rid of our weakness. But if d4, then knight to e4, and then our knight is under quite a bit of pressure. So probably not that. Probably not that. Let me think a second here. Knight d4? take, knight b5. Don't love it. Don't love it. e4. Queen f4. And then we don't have the move h6. We could play knight to h5. And if take, the knight is hanging and the bishop is hanging. That's nice. I'm going to play e4. I may not play knight to h5, but it looks decent. If queen h4, knight h5, queen g4, defending the bishop still. What can we do there? What can we do there? We could play a move like queen to d6. I don't really want to play that, though. Knight to e5 is probably a bit nicer. Wait. Yeah, this knight is hanging in those lines, but my queen is under attack. But I don't think it makes sense to move the queen. I think it makes more sense to counterattack my opponent's queen. Now, we'll see what he does. He might just play a more passive move like queen to d2, in which case I think we just play h6 and kick this bishop out. If bishop h4 maintaining the pin, we just kick it all the way back. Get our knight unpinned, and we're back to what we want to do. My opponent does go queen e2, so good prediction, I suppose. Let's play h6. Taking, I think, would be a really big mistake, and my opponent doesn't take, because then my bishop takes, and this knight is a big weakness, right? Especially because it's pinned to the rook. So the bishop goes to g3. The bishop is kind of restricted by all of my pieces on this diagonal. These are important squares for it to be controlling, potentially, but it is certainly restricted. I like the look of the move rook e8, preparing d4, because then we would have ample defense on the e4 pawn. I like that. Let's play rook e8. And I feel like we are really maximizing all of our pieces, right? Our knights are controlling the center brilliantly. Our pawns are fantastic in the center of the board. Our bishop is ready to open up against this knight. Our rooks are on important files. Our queen's on an important file. My opponent plays rook d1, which of course pins the d-pawn to my queen, which is admittedly annoying. I'd love to play the move d4, but we're not actually threatening to take because of the pin, which is annoying. The thing is, like, we could move our knight and unleash this attack, but it doesn't do anything. Maybe we can move this knight to unleash this attack. Maybe move like knight e5 looks interesting, or even knight to e7, defending d5. Opening up the attack, maybe preparing knight to f5. Okay, I want to play knight e5 or knight e7. Which one? If my opponent trades the bishop... Actually, I don't want him to trade the bishop like that, because then my rook gets in the way of everything. Let me think 1 second. I'm just thinking here, take. Oh yeah, that's fine, that's fine. Let's play this. We do give my opponent the 5 square. He technically could play that move because it would defend the knight. But if bishop to e5, maybe that's a good move. Maybe. Do we have knight g6? Okay, no, he plays h3. That doesn't feel correct because you just hang a knight. Let's take the knight. That's a free knight. My opponent eventually makes a mistake, and to be fair to him, he did lose a pawn on d4, but he certainly kept the fight going for a very long time in this game, and I think in this position, bishop to e5 would have been a little bit annoying, because if we play a move like knight to g6, bishop takes, queen takes, there's things like knight to d5, and I think maybe we're still better after a move like queen to b2, but it's not simple. Now my opponent plays bishop to e5, but it's too little too late at this point. He's already down a piece. Now we still need to convert this position, So let's make sure we do that with the utmost precision. I think we should just drop this rook back to c8, maintain our powerful pieces, and my opponent plays f4, which is a very good move. That's a really, really good move. He's trying to cause complications in the position, which is very smart. Can we play this? That's a very smart idea. Because if I take en passant, then like queen f3, and this is a lot of pressure, right? So I don't want to allow that. I don't want to open the f-file, really. Let me think. I think knight g6 makes the most sense. Reason being, we're attacking this bishop, right? If f takes g5, which he does, if we do take the bishop, probably with the rook, take, that's okay. What happens if we take the pawn? Well then, I don't know, I don't like the pressure on the knight, really. The bishop would have to move, so let's say bishop b2. Then we have knight to f4, though. Then we have knight f4, and the queen is in a bit of a predicament. Let's say queen f2. Let's say queen f2. Well, then we have moves like e3. So no, actually, I'm going to take back. Because if the bishop retreats to a square like g3, then our knight is under pressure no longer. And I'd love to play a move like knight h5, but the queen does control that square, unfortunately. But it relieves the pressure if the bishop retreats this way. If the bishop retreats this way, then we can play knight to f4, and this pawn is going to become a bit of a monster. Going to become a bit of an issue for white to deal with. Now, if my opponent decides to take, then I think just bishop takes, the g-pawn is defended, we're preparing knight to f4, c2 is still weak, our center is still great, the e-pawn and the d-pawn is still going to charge down the board. That all looks very, very nice. This knight could try and get itself back into the game via the d4 square. Which is true, And maybe it could make its way to f5, which could be a little bit annoying. But at the end of the day, we are up a piece, so we should be fine. We should be absolutely fine. Again, I think my mic has moved again. Okay, I'm going to put it here. I hope this is a bit better. I don't know. I need to fiddle with it a bit more still. But it should be better than my previous videos regardless. Okay. We are down to 1:40. So we do have to be a little bit careful with our time usage. Don't try and be fancy with knight to f4, because just rook takes and our queen is still hanging, or even just taking the queen, but then we take on e2 with check. Maybe we can get away with that. Don't overcomplicate it. Just take. Just take. And knight to f4 is a bit of an issue for white. It's a bit of an issue. If knight f4, queen g4, I suppose that could be played, but then we can always take on... Oh no, we can't, because then my opponent can take on f4 and the g-pawn is pinned. So maybe we have to be a little bit careful with knight to f4, but g3 is played, which... Yeah, alright, that's quite weakening. I'm going to play rook to c3. I'm going to drop this bishop back, probably, but I really like the move rook to c3, because these are massive weaknesses, and neither rook d3 nor rook f3 can be played to defend them. Queen g4 can be played to defend, but then that does, for a start, hang the c2 pawn, but I think we... Oh no, we can't play queen to c8, because that hangs our bishop. So maybe we just drop the bishop back to g7, or we could play bishop to e5, actually, because g5 is still defended, and this is an issue for white if the queen is on the g4 square, because rook takes g3 would win the queen. The c2 pawn becomes a little bit irrelevant there, so I quite like that. Let's see what he goes for, though. He could play a move like king to g2 to defend the pawn. That is playable. He goes for king h2, which I feel like is a little bit worse, because now we can pin the pawn to the king. Do I want to use my queen or my bishop? Queen or bishop? I think queen. Maintaining an eye on the bishop still, though. Let's do it. He could play rook to g1, but then we relieve a lot of pressure if the rook is forced simply to do defensive duties, right? Yeah, he does go for that. We do have the move knight to h4, preparing knight to f3 check, because the knight cannot be taken, which is nice. If here we just take and then play it. If knight h4, knight to d2, that could be played. I think bishop e5 is easier to begin with, though, because we just add another attacker to the g3 pawn. And I mean, if we do take on g3, then we will have knight to f4. My opponent has to defend it. Now knight h4 can be met with queen takes g5 check, which isn't great for us. But we can take on c2 with check, which I think we should do. I think we should do that. We can always play a move like f6 to secure our g-pawn if we really want, but to be honest, I don't think it matters if my opponent takes on g5. I don't think that matters. If anything, that might just be a waste of time. Now, my idea here is if king h1, I could just bring my rook back to c3, renew the threat on the g3 pawn, but with the added bonus of attacking this knight, because there's no longer a c2 pawn to defend the knight. So if king h1, rook c3, my opponent can't just bring his king back to defend, because he'll lose the knight. So he instead chooses rook to d2, which I think we should probably take. We could retreat and just keep an eye. Well, yeah, that actually attacks the knight. So no, we're going to do this instead. Attack the knight. Keep an eye on g3. The knight also now does not have the d2 square to go to. The knight could go to d4, of course. And maybe it will get into f5, which could be a little bit annoying. If knight to d4, we don't have, again, this move because of queen takes g5, which is unfortunate. It is a bit unfortunate. Let me think a second. Yeah, he does play it. Maybe I should take. Maybe I should take. Because if the knight gets to f5, then we actually have an issue. So no, I'm just going to snap it off the board. I don't want to see it again. I don't want to see it. And now, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? This is an interesting move. Although, no, it actually isn't that interesting. We just hang this. We could just push. We could just push. What else can we do? We can't do this because of this. So maybe the move f6 is actually decent. Yeah, I'm just going to play f6. Just defend this. g5 can be played. But if g5, I think we can play knight to e5. Because my opponent can't take on g5 with check immediately. I think this works. And we attack the queen. And we also threaten knight to f3 check, right? So if my opponent plays a move like queen to h5, trying to maybe infiltrate and attack the rook. No, he plays queen to f5, which I think is a bit inaccurate, maybe. Can we now play this? I think we can. I think we can. Let's play it. Knight f3 check. Of course, if you take, then I'm just completely winning. So you have to move the king. Where are you going to put the king? Well, let's see what he does. King h1 makes the most sense, because king h3 lines up with my rook, and king g2 is obviously just very weak. King g2 like that. So he goes king h1, which makes the most sense. Now, don't do something like taking and opening up the rook. I mean, you can take the rook, but, like, it seems unnecessary to allow that. I'm tempted to play king g7, actually. If king g7 take, then we have rook h8 with mating nets forming. If king to g7, my opponent could take. And then rook to d7 is an issue. Oof. Maybe we have to take the rook. Oh, and there's no perpetual. There's no perpetual there. Yeah, we can go ahead and take this. There's no perpetual check. Yeah, we just run this way. And we're up a lot of material. I can't take because I would hang my queen. That was a nice move from my opponent. I'm just going to go king e7. I'm just going to run the king over here. I don't want any shenanigans happening. And I want to give my rook the h8 square as well to deliver a deadly check, forcing the king into the open. This is the move I was expecting, which is probably the best move. Because now my opponent can take on f6. Yeah, he does it. Let me think. I think we can... Oh, no, we can't. We can't do that. What am I on about? What about this? Can I get away with that? Yes, I can. Yes, I can. Because if we trade, the game's over, right? There's no checks on my king from anywhere because this diagonal is blocked off. If my opponent moves his queen, then I'm going to play queen to h8 and force the king out into the open. And from there, after moves like rook to c2, there should be some kind of mate forming. There has to be. Has to be a mate. Okay, let's see. And there's also, like, checking ideas to win the queen. Give a check. If king here, yes, then we just give this check. We give this check on h3, and after king to e1, I mean, maybe there's a mate, but at the very least we have knight to f3 check, winning the queen, and the rook and the king, but, like, most importantly, the queen. I think this is a mistake. I think that's a mistake, because just king to d1. So, let's just deliver the check on f3 with the knight. My opponent has done a very good job of making my life difficult here. I said it earlier in the game, but he's really done a good job, because I've been on low time. Like, it hasn't been simple to convert this endgame, so really well done to him. But yeah, this game was definitely not perfect, so there's going to be some very interesting analysis on this, which I would encourage you to stick around for. So, let's get straight into it. Okay, so the game review gives us an 88.2% accuracy, and my opponent a 77.7%. So we're going to see whether I played the opening correctly, and I think I did for the most part. So e4, c6, knight c3, d5. Now, typically, d4 is the move that you get, and I normally play this line with knight to f6, known as the Tartakower, and I have a whole video dedicated to literally everything that can happen after this position in the Caro Kann. But, sorry, I just had to take a call. But basically, yeah, I normally take and go knight f6 variations, but I wanted to try out... Sorry, that's not what was played, because my opponent did go knight to f3, but things kind of transpose anyway. So I go for g6, which I think if it's via this move order, is actually the Gurgenidze system. But via this move order with knight to f3, it looks like it's actually even stronger, which is interesting. I'd be curious to know why. If any of you guys know, please let me know down below, because I am learning this opening. My opponent takes on d5, which I didn't think was the right idea. I take back, d4, bishop g7. This is all fine. Bishop b5 check. Bishop d7, take, and queen takes. So this is all actually correct, which kind of surprises me, because I felt like I'd done something wrong by allowing the knight to e5. Whoa, I'm supposed to take this, and then play d4, and after knight e4, just go knight c6. Something like this. Okay, yeah, that's a bit of an issue. So, white's supposed to castle, and then I either take on e5 or play rook d8. Taking on e5 looks risky. Probably rook d8. And after rook e1, this is so weird because I don't have a dark squared bishop. This actually looks really terrifying. The move I played queen d6 is still okay though. Bishop f4. And yeah, knight c6 is the best move, so I'm very happy about that. And the point is that there's no good discoveries for the bishop. This is kind of a weird theme of this game, where the bishop and the queen are aligned, but there's no good discoveries, because if you play knight to f7, yes, I'm correct in thinking this is completely winning for me, because after take, and bishop takes h8, there's so much pressure on the d4 pawn, which is kind of the point of the Gurgenidze. And if you take on d5, yeah, I'm correct. Queen e4 check, knight e3, and I can take on d4, and white is in some serious trouble. I'm going to castle queenside, play knight to f6, and my two minor pieces are going to absolutely dominate my opponent's rook. Particularly this bishop. Oh my god, bishops don't move like that. Which is a very powerful piece, right? So my opponent went knight to d3, which is a mistake. I should have played, apparently, queen e6 check, which I did consider. Oh yeah, I can just take on d4. And if queen e2, I just take on d4. I should have played that, but I went queen d8, which is still fine. We're still slightly better. Knight b5, though, is a mistake, yes. Because, I mean, if I play a move like rook c8, then my opponent just castles. Although even then I have a6 to boot the knight back and take on d4. But the point is I have queen a5 check. And the only way to save the knight is to retreat the knight. And then we take on d4 with the bishop, which is the correct move. So I'm so happy that I managed to realize that. I wanted to take with the knight. I really did. But moves like bishop e5 are just such an issue. They're such an issue, because I'm going to have to trade my bishop off then. Even if my opponent just castles, even if my opponent just does this, then I don't get to play the move e5, which is what I want to do. So I take with the bishop, which I was really happy I found. My opponent played bishop d2, which, yeah, was not a good move. He really should castle, because this is not good for black. You do not want to go pawn grabbing like this, because this is going to become a very strong bishop, and it becomes difficult to get your king castled. Moves like rook b1 just target b7, and the computer just wants to give up the b7 pawn, and it's like, why did you pick up that pawn in the first place? Because you're just going to lose it straight back. If you try too hard to hold on to the pawn, then the bar just slides more and more in favour of white. So my opponent went bishop d2 though, which I don't think was the right idea. I went bishop g7, which was the best move, which again I'm very happy about. I feel like I'm starting to understand some of the motifs and ideas of the Gurgenidze system, so I'm pretty happy about that. Queen f3 is played. A bit of a strange move. I went knight f6. Knight d4 was actually the best. And I assume queen d1 has to be played. But the computer wants to put the knight back on c6 because the knight doesn't belong on d4. So, yeah, I don't know about that, bruv. But I went knight f6, which is a fine move. My opponent castles. The best move is knight to f4, just applying more pressure. And if I castle, knight c takes d5, queen b5. Can I not just play a move like e6, though? Oh, no, because then I can't take with the queen, yeah. Can I play... Yeah, I still lose the pawn. Oh, so I have to give the pawn back. Unless I play d4. Knight d5, queen d8. Which looks fine. Yeah, no, this is fine. Okay, this is absolutely fine. My opponent castles, though, and he doesn't find knight f4. I also castle. a3 was just a weird move. I mean, I understand the point of it, but I don't think it was that good. We go e5, not the best move, but still pretty good. The computer wanted to play rook a to c8 immediately. I suppose anticipating the move b4 to get ready to exploit the undefended knight. And if here... Yeah, the queen still goes to d8. I just wanted to see whether the computer would put the queen somewhere other than d8 in that line, but no. We go e5, b4, and queen d8 is definitely the best square for the queen, just keeping an eye on the d5 pawn. Knight c5 is played. I go b6, just kicking the knight back. If the knight goes to the a6 square, it's bad. It's bad because the knight has nowhere to go. Now, I probably won't be able to trap it, because a move like queen c8, b5 protects the knight, attacks my knight, and gives the knight an escape square. But if I don't go after the knight, and I just play like knight d4, queen d1, and just continue with my game plan, the knight is going to have to take a couple moves to get back into the game. It's kind of a dead piece. on a6. I mean, obviously the saying the saying of a knight on the rim is dim isn't always true, but in this case it's absolutely true. This knight does nothing. So my opponent goes back to b3, which makes far more sense. I go rook c8. e4 is a better move, attacking the queen. And after queen e2, then rook c8. Okay, sure. Bishop g5. e4 is the only... Okay, not the only good move, but it's certainly the only move that maintains a big advantage. So I'm very happy that I found that. Now, I was expecting the move queen g4. Oh, that hangs the queen. Sorry, not queen g4. Queen f4. This is the move I was expecting. And I was planning to meet this with knight to h5, which the computer does approve of. So again, very happy I saw that. We have attacks going on all over the board now. Queen g4 was what I thought my opponent would play. And then I was initially thinking of knight e5. Now, f5 can also be played by the looks of it. And there are still 2 hanging pieces. Maybe I would have found that. My initial thought was knight to e5. And the best move is taking on h5. And then the best move for black isn't even to take, but go queen d7, saving the queen. If queen h3 trying to protect the knight, then we can just take and then take. We also have knight to f3, and you can't take because your queen is then undefended. So that's very interesting. Point is, this knight's going to fall. But we go e4. My opponent retreats rather than coming forward. We play h6, which is the best move, and my opponent retreats. Now, taking is not a good idea, because like I said, bishop takes, and this knight is a big problem. How do you defend the knight? You know, queen d2, I can take on b4, and if you take back, then take with a fork, the game is over. Bishop h4, g5, chasing the bishop away, and I go rook e8, and that's a mistake. Wow. Wow, I need to find... There's a couple moves I can play, but I basically need to move this knight either e8 or h7 so that my bishop opens up against the knight. Now, the reason I didn't do that is because I wanted to bring my knight forward, right? Which is typically what you want to do. Backwards knight moves are notorious for being difficult to find. The problem with what I did is after rook e8, rook a d1 is a mistake. White's best move is knight b5. Threatening knight d6. And if rook e6, then you have maybe knight 3d4. Take. And then you just come back. The computer doesn't think I can stop the knight from getting to d6 properly. Really interesting. But that's not what happened. My opponent went rook a to d1. And I can't blame him for being concerned about this diagonal. Knight e7. Yeah, I should have just taken on b4. I don't know why I didn't do that, actually. I don't know why I didn't do that. I think I was thinking that I could get more, and I didn't have to give my knight up for just a pawn. Like, obviously we go up a pawn because we win the knight, but I guess the rook on c3 is actually also really active. Again, my opponent needs to find the move knight b5 or bishop e5. Now, I was concerned about the move bishop e5. I didn't see this knight b5 idea. The point is, you're putting pressure on my knight. You're also defending your own knight, and there's a lot of pressure on the d5 pawn. The best move here is knight h5. Of course, if take, then take, and you can't take on h6 because you lose the knight on c3. So, knight e4 playing on this pin. Knight g6? Maybe threatening ideas like taking on h7 with check and winning the knight. Knight g3. Knight f4 if the queen takes on h6. Whoa, is the queen getting trapped? I think the queen's getting trapped. That's crazy. Oh, that just hangs the queen. But yeah, the queen's getting trapped there, so the queen has to retreat. Some crazy lines, but fortunately my opponent missed the fact that the knight was hanging on c3, which obviously works for us, but the game is not quite over. We take on c3. Bishop e5 is the best move. Here the computer wants to take on b3, which I did consider, but I felt like I didn't have to give my rook up for the knight. So I instead played rook c8, which is still good. Still good. f4 was a great move from my opponent. I was really impressed with it, because if I take, Okay, I suppose rook to f4 just gets met with knight to g6. But I just didn't want the f-file opening up, essentially. I just didn't want it open. You know, there's ideas of bishop h6, rook f6. And I'm probably still winning, but it's unnecessary counterplay. So I find the best move with knight g6, attacking the bishop and the pawn. My opponent takes on g5. We take on g5. We can take here as well. That is also perfectly viable. Yeah, this is fine, to be fair. But I decided to take on g5 instead, because my opponent did take on f6, but I was thinking that if the bishop retreats to g3, then the pressure is gone, and I can just play chess, right? And I'm up a piece. And if the bishop comes to b2, then I have knight f4 ideas, which the computer does agree with. Now, why was I concerned? What was I concerned about here? I don't know. Because the computer thinks that white has to give up the queen. If the queen goes to a square like e1, then we just win c2. If the queen goes to a square like d2, then we just push and push. So it's game over. So instead my opponent takes, which makes a lot of sense. And after bishop takes and then g3, stopping the knight from coming to f4, but I wasn't even threatening knight to f4. Because let's say I move like rook d2, I can't really play this because of queen g4, and this is a threat. So g3 is played, which isn't that great. I go rook c3, which is the best move, just pressuring everything in the position. King h2, I thought was good, but I don't know. King g2 looked a bit better to me, although the computer does disagree. I wonder why. Oh, I guess because, yeah, you want to keep the g-file open for the rook to help defend. No, that makes sense. So queen d6, rook g1, bishop e5, queen g4. The pawn is defended, and I have no way to add another attacker. Now, I was considering in this position the move knight to h4, to get the knight into f3, but I thought that knight to d2 could be played, stopping my knight from getting in. And I did see that I could win the c2 pawn. Maybe I should have gone for this. Because if rook g2, I can still... Oh no, I just win the rook there. And this is kind of a threat. I don't know how white stops that. Maybe here, and then if I go for this, then rook f3. And if take, then take. Although I'm still winning, but I can do this first. And I'm still up a piece. But it's too complicated, right? It's overly complicated. So just keep things simple, especially because I only have a minute 30 left on the clock. I know a lot of you would find a way to lose this position, and I know that I've certainly found ways to lose these kinds of positions in the past, because it's often too easy to, I don't know if that's an oxymoron, but too easy to overcomplicate the position, if you get what I mean. Just keep it simple. Take a pawn, rook d2, rook c3. Now, I could have taken on d2 with check, which is fine, but I thought rook c3 was a bit better, because this is just problematic for white. He goes knight d4, and I take, because if I don't take, what are some candidate moves? Let's say queen f6. I didn't like the idea of the knight getting to f5, because I thought I could never kick it out. Now, the computer finds this rook to f3 idea, where the queen comes to f6 and the rook comes to f3 to team up on the knight. Realistically, I was not going to see that with a minute left on the clock. If I play something like this, then maybe this knight is quite annoying. After a move like rook f2, knight to h6 is a threat winning my queen. It's unnecessary complications again. So instead, I just take the knight. And after rook takes d4, f6, not the best move, but it's fine. h4 is played, which is a good idea from my opponent. I go knight to e5, which is the best move attacking the queen. Queen f5, I thought queen h5 was a bit better, and the computer agrees. Although I suppose it's probably all winning for me. Queen f5. I go knight to f3 check, king h1, and I take on d4. Now, I didn't take on g1 because of rook to d5. You can see the eval bar swinging a bit. Although that's not the best move. Oh, the computer changed its mind because of queen f8. Now, if I take on g3, for example, then I'm actually losing. After queen g6, here, rook g5. Yeah, like, you've got to be careful still. And that's the reason that I took on d4, because I thought the rook on g1 is a far lesser threat. Now, I did have to make sure that after queen g6, king f8, I was able to get my king to safety. My opponent takes on g5, and I can't take back because I lose my queen. So I go king e7, which is the best move. Queen g7 check, king d8. And we get out of the woods here, and I go queen f8, which isn't necessarily the best move, but the issue is that my opponent has no choice other than to trade queens with me. Otherwise he loses, but he of course can't afford to trade queens. So queen g5 is considered an inaccuracy by the engine, but he doesn't have a choice. His only chance is to keep the queens on the board. This leads to forced mate in 7 apparently. After king g2, rook c2, king f1, queen h3. Okay, knight f3 is apparently a quicker path to mate, because I suppose this is actually a threat of checkmate now. But again, I've got 30 seconds on the clock. Just keep it simple. Check on h3. My opponent either gives up a rook and gets mated, or he moves his king. And then we play knight to f3 check, and the game is over. The game is over because we just win the queen. After king d1, we don't overcomplicate things, like the computer likes to move queen h2, allowing queen takes d5, and going, oh, the king is safe on c7. Who wants to calculate that? Just win the queen. Just take the queen, and the game is done. And my opponent, my opponent resigns after the move knight to f3, because he knows that he's going to lose his queen. And we keep things nice and simple, and we win the game. Now, I was very happy with this game because I'm really glad the computer approves of my use of this Gurgenidze system, and it thinks that it's a transposition to a modern defense, but it doesn't really matter. If it does, then it's a very favorable modern defense, because most of the time black is like, white is like got a plus 0.7 advantage for the first like 15 moves. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you want to see another really cool Caro Kann video, then check out the video here. And if you want to see the previous episodes of this series, then there'll be some playlist link, oh my god, down there, sort of. I've seen those videos.